Southwest Airlines now controls more than half of every seat flying out of Nashville International Airport. No single carrier holds that level of dominance at any other mid-size U.S. airport. Here's the part that shouldn't be possible. The airline that built this hub walked away and never came back. American Airlines opened Nashville's hub in 1986. At its peak, 265 flights a day, nearly 80 cities. 9 years later, American shut the whole thing down and left. For decades, nobody rebuilt it. Then, without warning, everyone showed up anyway. Delta added routes, United added routes, and British Airways started flying non-stop to London, while Frontier, JetBlue, and Alaska all circled an airport American had given up on. Nashville just posted 26.7 million passengers in a single year, a record, with no dominant hub carrier ever rebuilding what American tore down. Something is pulling every airline back to a city one of them left for dead. To understand why that number is strange, you have to go back to 1986, when American Airlines picked Nashville for one plain reason: geography, not romance. Draw a circle around the eastern two-thirds of the country and Nashville sits close to the middle of it, within a 2-hour flight of almost every major city east of the Mississippi. A hub airline doesn't ask where people want to go. It asks where it can connect the most cities with the fewest wasted miles between them, the way a spider picks the center of the web before it spins a single thread. American built fast, and by April of 1993 it was running 265 departures a day out of Nashville, feeding somewhere between 79 and 80 destinations through a single terminal that, according to people who worked the ramp back then, still had jet bridges bolted on, almost as an afterthought to a building designed years earlier for propeller planes, back when passengers walked across open tarmac to board. It worked for a while, the way every hub works for a while, not because the city demanded it, but because the airline needed a spoke there, and Nashville happened to be sitting in the right spot on the map at the right moment in American's expansion. Then American's math changed. The airline was consolidating its network around Dallas-Fort Worth and Chicago, folding smaller hubs into bigger ones. In 1995, 9 years after opening it, American walked away completely, closed the gates, and moved its Nashville-based staff and aircraft elsewhere. One detail needs correcting here, on screen, because it gets repeated wrong often enough to have become its own small myth online. Some retellings claim American itself was flying non-stop to London and Toronto at the peak of this hub, as proof of how important Nashville once was to the airline's global network. It was not. Those two routes came years later, added by British Airways and Air Canada, long after American had already left the city entirely and had nothing left to lose from someone else succeeding where it hadn't. American's own attempt at a Nashville to London route never got anywhere close to that success. The route lost money for the airline and was cut inside 2 years of launching. The international hub that people now remember fondly was built by two entirely different airlines on the ruins of the one that quit first. For most of the next 2 decades, Nashville settled into the role you would expect a post-hub airport to settle into, a solid regional airport growing steadily alongside the city around it, but nobody's strategic centerpiece and nobody's headline infrastructure project. Compare that to what usually happens after a hub carrier leaves a mid-size American city. St. Louis lost its TWA hub and never fully replaced the flights or the jobs that came with it. Pittsburgh lost US Airways and spent years watching gates sit empty. That's the expected script. A city loses its hub carrier, and the airport simply shrinks into whatever traffic is left over once the connecting flights disappear. No airline was racing to rebuild what American tore down in Nashville, because on paper, following that script, nobody needed to. Southwest had already been flying into Nashville since the 1980s, steadily adding routes the way it adds routes almost everywhere in the country, point-to-point, low cost, with no hub ambitions written into a single press release or route announcement. That distinction matters because what happened over the following 20 years did not look like a hub being deliberately rebuilt by anyone. It looked like an airline discovering it already had one, without ever setting out to build it. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, while other carriers treated Nashville as a stopover market at best, Southwest kept stacking flights on top of flights until the schedule started, doing something a simple point-to-point network is not supposed to do on its own. It started functioning like a connection point in its own right, whether Southwest's own marketing department meant it to or not. Nobody at Southwest headquarters sat down in, say, 2005 and drew up a 5-year plan to out-hub the hub American had already abandoned. A focused city network doesn't grow that way. It grows one profitable route at a time, added because the demand on that one route justified another airplane, and only years later does someone look at the finished map and notice that the sum of all those individual decisions has produced something that behaves suspiciously like a hub, even though nobody in the building ever called a meeting to build one on purpose. That slow accumulation is what every retelling flattens into one dramatic turning point, when the real mechanism was 2 decades of small, individually justified route additions, compounding into something nobody had planned. By the most recent count available, Southwest controls over half of all seat capacity flying through Nashville, a share no single carrier holds at any comparably sized U.S. airport, a number that would normally only show up at an airline's officially designated, formally built hub. Southwest itself does not call Nashville a hub. It calls it a focus city. Heavy point-to-point service, without the full connecting infrastructure or the operational promises a true hub carries. This debate keeps surfacing in the comments under every video that has touched this topic. Is that distinction still honest, or has the label simply stopped matching what's flying out of the gates every day? If you have an opinion on that, it is worth settling in the comments below, because reasonable people watching this channel land on both sides of it. And if arguments backed by a hard number instead of a guess are the reason you keep coming back, subscribing costs you nothing, and it is how you will catch the next one before most people ever hear about it anywhere else. A handful of frequent flyers have pointed out that you can already book a single Southwest itinerary from Knoxville through Nashville to nearly anywhere else in the network, connecting through Nashville the same way you would connect through any hub in the country. You are just not supposed to call it that out loud in a press release. It is the same layover, the same short walk between gates, the same bag tag printed straight through to the final destination. Only the label on the boarding pass pretends otherwise. The fairest answer, once you look past the marketing language, sits somewhere in between those two positions. Southwest has not built dedicated hub infrastructure in Nashville, and you will not find the city marketed to connecting passengers the way Atlanta or Dallas gets marketed every day, with connection ads and layover lounges built around the idea. But walk the B concourse on a Tuesday morning and watch how many passengers never leave the terminal at all. Just swap gates and keep going. For a sizable and growing slice of itineraries, Nashville is already operating like a hub, no matter what word ends up on the departure board. This doesn't happen in a city that isn't already growing underneath it, and Nashville's growth has almost nothing to do with any single airline's decisions at all. The metro is now home to more than 900 healthcare companies, anchored by HCA Healthcare, the largest for-profit hospital operator in the entire country, headquartered a few miles from the terminal, with executives who fly constantly between Nashville and every market HCA operates in. Oracle broke ground on a new campus on the Cumberland River, expected to eventually house thousands of employees relocating from other cities, many of whom will fly home to visit family on the same connecting itinerary this whole story is about. Tourism alone pulls in an estimated $11.2 billion a year, with something close to 17 million visitors passing through the city for music, conventions, bachelorette weekends, and everything else Nashville has spent the last decade selling to the rest of the country as a destination rather than a stopover. Stack a hospital executive flying to a conference, an Oracle transplant flying home for Thanksgiving, and a bachelorette party flying in for a weekend on Broadway, and you get a metro area that would generate serious air travel demand no matter which airline happened to show up and serve it first. Southwest did not create that demand out of nothing through clever marketing. It simply happened to be the carrier already sitting in the building, with the schedule already in place the moment the demand arrived in full force. Timing, more than strategy, is doing most of the work in this story. An airline can build the best network in the country and still lose if the city underneath it stalls. Nashville's population and job growth did the opposite of stalling for a decade straight, and every one of those new residents, new hospital hires, new Oracle employees, and new tourists eventually needs a flight somewhere. Not one of them cares whether the airport they're flying out of is technically a hub, a focus city, or something in between. They care whether there's a seat on the flight they want, at a price they can live with. And increasingly in Nashville on more routes every year there is. American Airlines coming back into this market matters more than it might look on paper at first glance, because this is the same airline that decided in 1995 that Nashville wasn't worth the infrastructure it had already built there. 30 years later, American is expanding service back into the exact city it once walked away from. Not because it suddenly regrets the decision it made in 1995, but because ceding a fast-growing metro entirely to Southwest, Delta, and United is a far worse business decision today than staying open ever was back then. Delta has quietly built up its own Nashville presence over several years, treating the city as a strong secondary market rather than a headline hub project worth announcing loudly. United has added routes on that same logic, expanding without ever calling any of it a hub either, matching capacity city by city as demand shows up. The international side of this story belongs almost entirely to carriers that never had any stake in American's old hub at all. British Airways has flown non-stop to London since 2018 on a wide-body Airbus A350, a route that did not exist in any form during American's own hub era and required no permission from the airline that once ran this airport. Aer Lingus now connects Nashville directly to Dublin on an A321 XLR, a long, thin aircraft purpose-built for this kind of route. Solid demand, but not quite enough of it yet to justify a wide body. The city that one legacy carrier decided in writing was not worth keeping a hub in now supports 2 transatlantic routes that carrier never once operated itself in 9 years of trying. Neither British Airways nor Aer Lingus needed permission from American, or from Southwest, or from anyone else already flying out of Nashville to make that call. They looked at the same growing metro everyone else in this story is reacting to, ran their own numbers on business travel, tourism, and the size of the local expatriate and diaspora communities that fly home for holidays, and decided the math worked without waiting for a legacy hub carrier to validate the market first. International service is arriving in Nashville in a meaningfully different way than it did under American's old hub model, where new routes existed largely to feed American's own connecting traffic rather than to serve Nashville passengers flying point to point. Then, in May of 2026, the industry handed Nashville an opportunity nobody had planned around. Spirit Airlines shut down completely, ceasing every single operation it ran anywhere in the country, grounding its entire fleet for good. Spirit had spent years fighting the same brutal, thin-margin price war every ultra-low-cost carrier eventually gets pulled into, and this time the airline simply ran out of runway before it could find a way out. For an airport this size, a competitor of that scale disappearing overnight is not a footnote buried in an earnings call. It is an open door, and every remaining low-cost carrier in the country knew it within hours, because a route Spirit used to fly does not disappear along with the airline. Somebody still wants to fly it, and somebody is going to sell them that seat. Frontier, JetBlue, and Allegiant, the low-cost carriers still standing after years of brutal fare wars, have been racing into the gaps Spirit left behind across the entire national route map, and a growing airport with solid demand and rising fares is the kind of market a low-cost carrier fights hardest to grab quickly before a rival gets there first and claims the gates. Nashville was not the only airport touched by Spirit's collapse. Airports across the country lost a carrier overnight. But Nashville is one of the airports best positioned to absorb that fallout fastest, because the underlying demand there was already accelerating well before Spirit ever went under, which meant there was somewhere for that displaced capacity to go. The evening news almost never covers this part. When a carrier disappears, its planes and pilots don't vanish, and neither does the demand those routes were built to serve. Somebody else absorbs both, city by city, and the airports that come out ahead are not necessarily the biggest ones. They're the ones that were already growing fast enough and had enough open gate capacity to take the traffic in, rather than just watch a rival announce a press release about it. Nashville, mid-expansion on its own terminal and already courting every low-cost carrier in the country, was built to catch that wave rather than miss it. Southwest, for its part, is defending this market for reasons that reach well beyond Nashville alone. Activist investor Elliott Management took a stake in Southwest and pushed the airline to abandon decades of open seating. Adding assigned seats and new bag fees, changes Southwest had resisted publicly for years, calling them core to its brand and its identity as the airline that treated passengers differently, before finally giving in to sustained shareholder pressure that made the old model impossible to defend on a quarterly earnings call. An airline under that much financial scrutiny doesn't casually give up its strongest, most defensible markets to a rival just to make a point. Nashville, where Southwest already holds a share most airlines only get to dream about at any airport in the country, is precisely the kind of position it can point to on an earnings call when it needs to show its own investors that the underlying network still works, even after all the changes shareholders forced on it. The fight over Nashville, then, is not simply airline versus airline in the abstract. It is Southwest defending the one city where its older strategy is still visibly winning, while every rival tries to prove, flight by flight, that it cannot stay that way forever. Activist pressure of this kind tends to focus an airline's attention on the markets where it can least afford to look weak. And Nashville, ironically, is now one of the strongest cards Southwest has to play in a boardroom conversation that has nothing to do with airplanes at all. Lose share here, and the argument that the old Southwest model still works gets a lot harder to make in front of people who are already skeptical of that model in the first place. Hold it, and Nashville becomes the counterexample Southwest can point to every single time someone questions whether the airline still knows how to win a market on its own terms. That is a strange place for a focus city to end up. Not just a good route network anymore, but a talking point in a fight over the entire company's future direction. All of that competition is now showing up in concrete and steel, not just in route announcements. Nashville's Airport Authority has committed more than $4.5 billion in capital spending since 2017, split across two major projects: BNA Vision, which rebuilt the terminal itself from the ground up, and New Horizon, which is expanding the airport's physical footprint well past its current size. Built for growth, the authority expects to keep compounding for decades. None of it runs on tax dollars. The airport funds the work entirely through its own operating revenue, the same way a private company would fund an expansion out of its own earnings rather than a public bond issue. One of the more ambitious pieces still pending FAA approval is an extension of Runway 2 left, aimed squarely at something Nashville has never supported before in its entire history: long-haul service to Asia, the kind of route only a hub-scale airport usually earns, and not the kind of project an airport authority funds on a hunch. No carrier currently flies that route out of Nashville at all, which is exactly the gap the extension is built to close. Somebody at BNA is looking at the same growth curve this whole story has been tracing and betting hard cash that it keeps climbing for another decade. Set that against 1995, when American looked at this same airport and decided the infrastructure wasn't worth maintaining for one more year. 30 years later, Nashville is outbuilding airports that never lost a hub in the first place, funded entirely by traffic that showed up on its own, with no single airline planning any of it from the top down as a deliberate strategy. American Airlines proved in 1995 that you could walk away from Nashville and lose almost nothing lasting in the process. 6 different carriers are now betting, all at the same time, that you cannot afford to walk away from it a second time, and the next few years of expansion decisions will be the actual scoreboard that finally settles who turns out to be right. The airline that gets this wrong won't lose a headline. It will lose the one market every one of its rivals has already decided is worth fighting for.